because reading fiction is actually really good for you. It's something that can do a lot of things for your mind and body and everything. So a lot of people said they want to read more, they just don't have time, but it's really important to find the time, especially something that's not directly about productivity, because of all the things it can do for you. So one of the big, huge things that reading fiction does, and why the things that I'm very passionate about it, is because it really can help you build empathy. There is nothing else that can get you that chance to get inside somebody else's head, to see their point of view, to read about what's going on in their life and the things that are influencing them, than actually in their words, in a book that you could hold in your hands and experience it from their point of view. There are actual functional MRIs that show that when we imagine stories, the parts of our brain that are responsible for better understanding others and that for seeing the world from a new perspective actually light up and become active. It's also really good for improving relationships. It's proven to work as what they call a reality stimulator, which is the idea that you can put yourself in a situation, you can imagine how you'd respond to it, you can see how the protagonist responds to it, and actually see how that resonates and how that feels with you, and so that you can test out things in fiction, in something that you're experiencing that way before you test it out in real life, and that you're actually having to test it out on your friends and family that may not take it as well as if you just throw the book across the room. Reading fiction also reduces stress. You can see some stats up here that I found about how it can, it's like reduces stress more than listening to music, than a cup of tea, than going for a walk. It's actually, shown to lower your heart rate. And so just imagine, like, if you were to sit down for a few minutes with the music on, with a cup of tea, and read a book, just imagine how relaxed you would feel. And it's even shown that it has more of an effect on the brain than meditation, which is really great for me because meditation puts me right to sleep, which leads to the next point, which is that reading fiction can be shown to improve your sleep. So I was even able to get a Tim Ferriss quote in here. So do not read nonfiction prior to bed, which encourages projection into the future and preoccupation planning. Read fiction that engages the imagination and demands present state attention. Recommendations for compulsive nonfiction readers include Motherless Brooklyn and Stranger in a Strange Land, both of which I've read, both of which are great. So it's just this idea that instead of sitting there and reading about productivity and these things that you should be doing and going over your to-do list and then laying in bed and being like, did I get everything on there, that you actually take yourself into another state, that you start imagining other things, and then your brain can kind of drift off to sleep, imagining yourself in these places that are fictional and less stressful than that to-do list of what you have to do the next day. And also that reading fiction builds language skills and slows memory decline. So, there's lots of, expected idea that if you're going to be reading a lot, if you're interacting with a lot of different things, that you're going to build your vocabulary, you're going to learn about concepts and ideas that are different from your everyday life. Well, if you're reading a lot of things that are nonfiction and they are written specifically to communicate the most information to the most number of people, they're going to be in a little bit more simplistic language. But fiction writers are building worlds of imagination. They're finding new ways to describe things, new metaphors. They're, pulling out all those weird words from the dictionary that you never had a reason to use and using them in sentences and these, beautiful flights of fancy. And so you're really building more of a vocabulary by doing that. And it's been able to show that it slows down memory decline. So that the idea, there have been some studies that show that older readers have a 32% lower rate of mental decline compared to those who don't. And they've also been able to do some studies that show that being an active, avid reader can actually slow down and mitigate the effects of Alzheimer's. And then also reading fiction promotes creativity and makes us happier. So they've, again, with being all the great things they can do with brain studies today, they've been able to figure out that people who read fiction, things that are open-ended, things that are less worried about coming to a conclusion or making an argument, have less of a need for cognitive closure. That idea that everything has to have one right answer, that everything has to have a process to it. It imagines you to let that what if kind of run wild in your brain. And because that what if is running wild in your brain, you can see different kinds of possibilities. And practicing that kind of thinking with a book, with things that you're not putting pressure on yourself to come up with some kind of solution, can kind of prime your brain to be able to do that in other ways, other things that you're doing in your life. And there are studies that show that those who read books regularly are more satisfied with their lives, happier, more likely to feel the things that they do in life are worthwhile. And in one study, 76% of people said that reading improves their life and helps to make them feel good. So there's all kinds of amazing things to read, even if you're not reading about the aliens. So I do think that there are some unique things that we can get from science fiction, specifically because of the focus of the people who are telling these kinds of stories, because what they're looking at. And I've used to read tons of stuff. I still read tons of things and read things all over the map, but the last few years I've gotten really passionate about the subject and really trying to go out there and find all kinds of different things in this sort of science fiction, speculative fiction, in this space where people are going out and they're trying to think beyond the murder mystery or the historical fiction of back in the day and uncovering what things were like and really trying to push their minds to go out there and find different things. Just some really unique things we can get from reading that. One of those is the fact that science fiction, it isn't actually about the future. It's actually about what's going on right now. And if you look at what's popular, what people are writing about, what's going on in different times, it's really a reflection of what people are preoccupied with and what they care about with what's going on in the world around them at that time. Frankenstein is widely considered one of the very first science fiction books. And if you read that, it's all about the consequences of unchecked experimentation, being able to create the monster. It's about the hot new technology in that day, which was electricity, which is what is able to bring the monster to life. It's all about the clash between those romantic ideals of nature and in the natural world against this new science that was becoming more of a force in people's day-to-day lives. And it also really, again, getting back to that empathy, it told part of the story from the point of view of the monster or Adam and let you get inside the head of this other person who was coming from this unknown perspective at that time. And that really hasn't changed. A few years ago, Never Let Me Go by Ishiguro made a big splash, and that one was about the idea of putting yourself in the mind and putting yourself in the life of someone who was raised to be a clone, as a clone, to be an organ donor. That, and again, that was the technology that was kind of an issue, something that was out there right there in that day that people were worried about, that people were thinking about, and what the reflection of that might be in their lives. Science fiction also is great at preparing us to deal with change. We get to see what's going on out there. We get to see what's happening that people are thinking about, seeing come down the pike that's going to have an impact on our lives. And we can start to experience that, think about how we would deal with that, how we feel about these things before we're actually forced to deal with them in our real lives. William Gibson is sort of famous for this, about having been able to write a lot of things about where he sees the future coming. He's the guy who's credited with inventing the word cyberpunk. And if you read some of his older books, stories from the 70s with black hat hackers and cyber war and the reality shows, so much of it is so much of what's going on in the world today. And the same thing with things now, like New York 2140 with the is all about climate change and living in a New York that's full of water and people are traveling in canals just like they would be in Venice. So it's, again, preparing us for that world to come. And finally, science fiction lets us experience other ways to live. Classic is Ursula Le Guin's with The Left Hand of Darkness, taking place in a world where everyone's a hermaphrodite. It's all about what would the world be, what kind of society would we have if there's no gender. Or something like Ancillary Justice, where it's actually where people are part of a hive mind, part of the ship itself, part of that AI. And then what happens when that goes away? And all those things about letting us experience other ways to live, experience things that we may not have to deal with today, helps us deal with those things in our own lives and in our future. And so aliens, AIs, other oddities, everything that's going on, it all boils down to, at the end, while you're reading these, is those stories always come back to the basic human things. We can't imagine anything that completely breaks us out of our human framework because our human framework is part of us. So when we read these stories and we see these things and we see things coming down the pike and someone tells us that social media is going to build this utopia of where everyone gets along and everything like that, when someone comes along and says segways are going to change the way cities are, we can always go back and say, like, no, I've seen these different futures. I've seen what people have imagined. And no, the real human characteristics are going to win out. No matter what changes, no matter what technology comes on, we're still us. And we should respond and assume that we're still going to be us. And that's the way that we should expect things to go. And that's it.